Hi everyone, it's Ruby G. Welcome to Truth and Neurons. What you're about to hear is not sensational. It's not fiction, it's real word for word. This is the actual law enforcement summary of the initial interview with Brian Kohberger after his arrest. I'm going to walk you through every segment, breaking it down with clinical insight and forensic context. Kohberger has documented diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and developmental coordination disorder. These matter, and in this episode, I'm going to explain why. On December 29, 2022, ISP Detective Sergeant Gilbertson, FBI Special Agent Shirley, and I arrived in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, in preparation for the service of the arrest and search warrants for Kohberger and his family's residence at redacted Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. At approximately 0200 hours on December 30, 2022, Kohberger was brought to the PSP Strasbourg Barracks and placed in an interview room. So if we think about this, he's Mirandized, he understands, and then there's the small talk that begins. This is a classic rapport building tactic, but with someone with autism spectrum, small talk is not small. It's a stressor. Kohberger stated he didn't follow WSU football much, but was a baseball fan. He was a first-year PhD student in criminal justice and criminology. Listen to the structure here. He's giving procedural, not emotional answers. His mind is locked into academic progression. This may sound evasive, but for someone with ASD or OCD, reverting to structured systems, application steps, program logistics is a form of emotional regulation. It's comfort. Kohberger mentioned that he applied for 2 PhD programs, the University of California, Irvine, and Washington State University, specifically because they didn't require the GRE. So let's break that down. The GRE, or Graduate Record Examination, is a standardized test often required for admission to graduate programs in the United States. It measures verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning, analytical writing, and critical thinking. In short, it's a high-pressure, high-stakes test that's notoriously rigid, timed, and performance-based. For someone with autism spectrum disorder, OCD, or developmental coordination disorder, the GRE can be especially punishing, not because of intelligence deficits, but because of how these conditions interact with test environments. Time pressure, ambiguity in language, and rigid formatting can all trigger anxiety, cognitive overload, or executive function disruptions. Kohberger choosing programs that waived the GRE wasn't laziness. It may have been a strategy, a calculated move to sidestep a system that penalizes neurodivergent thinking. If your mind works differently, a standardized exam isn't a measure of capability, it's a barrier to entry. Kohberger said he was strengthened by the fact that his mother and father were okay. He talked about his journey cross-country, avoiding snow, the beauty of the natural world, and its relationship to God. When Kohberger shifts the conversation to nature and God, it might seem like he's getting philosophical. But clinically, it tells us something deeper. For individuals with autism spectrum disorder, sensory-seeking behaviour is often a form of self-regulation. Nature offers something the human world rarely does. Predictability. Trees don't interrogate you, mountains don't lie. The environment follows patterns, light, colour, sound, that can soothe a nervous system overwhelmed by chaos. This wasn't just idle reflection. In moments of extreme stress, neurodivergent individuals often retreat into abstract or spiritual thinking, not to avoid reality, but to make sense of it. While law enforcement danced around the real reason he was being questioned, Kohberger spoke about meaning, beauty, and the divine, possibly because those were the only stable things that he could access at that moment. In that sense, his talk of nature wasn't irrelevant. It may have been the only space where he felt safe enough to speak freely. Kohberger stated it was because he loved being in college and stated knowledge was far more important to him than money. He said WSU had a good program. Is this a forensic red flag? Not necessarily. But in this context, it tells us how Kohberger sees his place in the world. Through intellect, not emotion, not social status. The self-concept here appears to be entirely cognitive. He told a story about seeing an unmarked police car near Kansas City speed up behind him, catch up with another vehicle, turn on its emergency lights, then drive away. Kohberger describes a bizarre encounter, a ghost move by law enforcement. No pullover, no citation, no interaction, just lights on, lights off and gone. A ghost in the rear view. Now ask yourself, if this wasn't random, if this wasn't meant for another driver, was it a signal, a pressure tactic, a silent warning that he's being watched? The timeline suggests this took place during the now infamous cross-country drive from Washington to Pennsylvania. It fits in the window when Kohberger was under surveillance, possibly tailed by multiple agencies. Now imagine, just for a moment, that Brian Kohberger is in fact innocent. Imagine he's been framed, whether by human error, tunnel vision, or something more sinister. He's neurodivergent, alone, pulled from his family home by SWAT in the middle of the night, then dropped into a sterile interview room 2,500 miles from the scene of the crime. And now every vague police encounter, every unmarked car, every stop without citation suddenly feels like a piece of the puzzle he didn't know he was part of. How does a person process that? Especially someone with autism, OCD and DCD, with a brain wired for exactness and order. How do you make sense of a world that's turning into a nightmare where law enforcement won't tell you why you're there, but you already know that you're doomed? Kohberger then talked about how busy he was and how the funding package made it worth it. He discussed ongoing projects with WSU PD and Pullman PD. We now have records confirming that Brian Kohberger applied to the Pullman Police Department. He was shortlisted and given an interview. The detail that makes it even more layered, the interview was conducted online only. But how do we know that? Well, we know that because Chief Jenkins himself has said it publicly. He clarified that the interview wasn't in person, that Kohberger was never in the building, that it was just a video call. Now ask yourself, why volunteer that detail? Why feel the need to emphasise that it was virtual, unless it's something Jenkins is trying to distance the department from? Here's where it gets murky. If you're going to make that claim, where's the evidence? Where's the time-stamped video call log? The panel interview notes? None of it's been released. Instead, we've been handed a statement on national television designed to minimise contact while subtly acknowledging that it did in fact happen. This isn't about the format of the interview. It's about the motivation behind controlling the narrative. Because Kohberger was seriously considered for a role in law enforcement. And if he was in active discussions with Pullman PD just months before the murders, then that opens a door to a much larger sequence of questions. What information did he gain access to, even in the recruitment process? Why did the department initially act like there was no connection? And what does a selective transparency tell us about what they might be trying to protect? When you say someone was never in the building, but you don't show the receipts, you're not clarifying, you're controlling optics. That kind of behaviour isn't neutral, it's strategic, it's shielding. You've been arrested without warning. You don't know what evidence they have. You're aware you've been watched. You notice familiar faces. You ask why you're there, and they won't tell you. So you default to the only thing you can control: structure, rules, facts. You talk about what you know: school, roads, application processes. You don't emote, not because you're guilty, but because your brain's survival strategy is cognitive distancing. That's not relaxation, that's defense, psychological defense, neurodivergent coping. So I'd like to ask my viewers, if a neurotypical person acted calm during an interrogation, we'd call them cold, right? But if a neurodivergent person does it, what are we really seeing? Is it composure? Or is it a mask forged by fear and decades of trying to fit into a world that punishes difference? Kohberger then stated he understood why we were engaging in small talk, but would appreciate it if we explained to him what he was doing there. Detective Sergeant Gilbertson said we were there because of what occurred in Moscow. Brian Kohberger is a man accused of monstrous acts. This interview does not tell us if he did it. However, the interview to me does not provide any red flags. But it does show us how Kohberger communicates, what he fixates on, how he handles stress, and how his neuropsychological makeup plays into all of that. Autism, OCD, DCD, they aren't excuses, they're frameworks. That's all for today's episode of Truth and Neurons. If you found this analysis helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the ethics of media commentary in high-profile cases. Until next time, keep thinking critically and questioning everything. Cheers, bye.